a lot to me personally. So a few months ago, when I was working at the Myaamia Center as part of a sabbatical from my normal job in California, Chachensa, or George Einstrack, asked me, how different was the ecology of Kansas and then later Oklahoma to Indiana? How different were the removal lands for the Myaamiaki upon arriving there? And it made me think of a few more questions regarding eastern Myaamionki, or Indiana, and western Myaamionki, which is how I will refer to them a little bit here, the western lands in Kansas and Oklahoma. The questions were, did the landscape look the same or was it different? Did the crops like Myaamia, the corn, did they grow as well in the new lands as they would here or in Indiana? And did wild food plant availability change when the Myaamiaki found themselves in Kansas and then later Oklahoma? Were the same foods available? Was it different? And I'd thought about this a little bit when I was doing my work with Myaamia project during my graduate school work here, but I got to take a little bit more in-depth look for this talk. So first I'm just going to describe a little bit about the ecosystems of Indiana, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So this is an early map of Indiana, one of the earliest known vegetation maps created in 1830 of Northwestern Indiana. And I say earliest known cautiously, indicating the earliest known Western science map that the Myaamia people knew and had mental and verbal maps of this area long before this was made. But with that caveat, if you look closely, which it's not going to be easy for you to see, but it's showing predominantly a forest ecosystem. Forest, swamp, and a few grasslands and dune ecosystems thrown in there. But those openings in the greater forest of Myaamionki, or eastern Myaamionki, were rare. So it was mostly shaded, forested, mostly wet. Later, another map indicating the original vegetation of Indiana, created by Robert Gordon in 1936, but still indicating the vegetation even before that. It's not showing a lot of agricultural fields, although there were those at that time. Most of it, this was still forest, 40% oak hickory forest, 10% beech forest, 20% swamp forest, so a lot, about 75% of it is forested, just to further prove my point with Western science, and a little bit of prairie. There are prairie openings, but also some of you may know that the openings, the grasslands, like prairies, were mostly maintained by indigenous peoples, burning and keeping them open. And just like you, if you stop mowing your lawn around here, it's going to turn into woods in about 10 years. So the openings were human created and maintained. So this is really mostly what you see when you live around northern Indiana. It's what the Myaamiaki lived and used and called home, was a forest system, wooded, shaded, and lush. About, I don't know if you can see at the bottom there, 50% in general. I'm throwing generalities at you to keep it simple for now, but pretty accurate, was beech or oak hickory forest. There are a few openings too. This isn't exactly from northern Indiana, but similar. You'd be walking through the forest and you might come upon an opening of a grassland, and about 25% of northern Indiana is like this. You might have experienced this yourself. Those are often agricultural fields now. So 25% prairie, a little bit of swamp and wetlands in northern Indiana, and that used to be a lot more in the past. In 1816, about half of the surface area or land cover of northwestern Indiana was underwater 6 months of the year. So it's very wet, inundated area. So It was a very swampy, wet ecosystem, and that was a positive in some ways for keeping European settlement at bay because it was considered hard to travel through and an area of high malaria contact. So that worked for a little while. So still talking just about Indiana, and then I'll start to do some comparisons in a minute between other areas. Growing season, about 80 to 120 days up in northern Indiana. You can see, I can see it more clearly, but the light blue is showing you a shorter growing season than even southern Indiana. A roughly 3-month growing season for the Myaamiaki to cultivate their crops, including the corn, for which they were known to have 2 or 3 crops staggered per year they could fit in. So now look a little briefly at Kansas. Short look at the vegetation and climate, and then start to make some comparisons. Kukler made this map of the original vegetation of Kansas. It was made in 1974, but it was of the original vegetation, again, discounting the development in agriculture for the most part. The red square indicates the eastern portions of Miami and Lynn counties where the Myaamiaki were removed to first. Within that red square, it is 90% a tallgrass, prairie, and oak hickory forest mixture. So it's a kind of a mosaic within that, and about 10% floodplain vegetation. This is a quote that George Ironstrack gave me, which is really interesting. It was from Alfred Vaughn, an Indian sub-agent, writing back to his superior, Major Sinclair, who traveled with Myaamiaki on the removal boats. And it just kind of, it highlighted something I thought was interesting. He says, the Myamis are present, though temporarily located about 1 mile west of the military road on the Little Sugar Creek and about 13 miles south of the American Fur Company's fort at the ford of Osage River. And so far, they are very well pleased with the general aspect of their new homes. From my knowledge of the country, generally, I do not think they could be better suited. They have plenty of timber and most excellent water, and far enough from the main Osage River to escape the miasmatic, or noxious, influence of that stream. So the Myaamiaki had a lot of grievances with Major Sinclair, who accompanied them on the boats because of his neglect of the sick people and a number of other things. But in an interpreted quote from Chief LaFontaine, when they did arrive in Kansas, he also documented this. It was interpreted by a U.S. agent. This quote is interpreted from Chief LaFontaine, saying that they feel sorry that the government was forced to adopt strict measures for the removal from Indiana. They apologize to the government for being difficult, which caused the government to order troops to assist in their speedy removal. Their new country had been represented to them as a miserable, barren section without wood, without water, in fact, an open prairie where no one could exist, and where those who did immigrate would find a speedy grave. But now that they are most agreeably disappointed and surprised to find the country so different to the representations made to them in Indiana, that they are well pleased with their new home or country, and had they known the truth before, they would have moved without coercion and without the presence of troops. So it's indicating that it was a wonderful paradise that they arrived in Kansas. And to me, taking an ecological analysis, that it was so similar to what they had had in Indiana that it was basically the same, if not better. But it seems really unlikely that the Myaamiaki, who had to be removed at gunpoint and clung to the soil as they left their homelands, would recover so much during that boat trip from their trauma that they would be happy, apologetic, and grateful to be in Kansas once they arrived. So this interpretation of Chief LaFontaine's words seems, if not sarcastic, then perhaps just plain inaccurate. Either way, once the Myaamia people, even if it was true that it was so similar and so wonderful and that they were happy, once they started looking around a little further, they realized that even though maybe they were plopped down in a nice neck of woods, that nearby was a grassland and predominantly drier climate with a lot less forest and a lot less of the same food plants available that they had in Indiana. Take another look at a map. I apologize, I'm going to bombard you with lots of maps. Kukler's vegetation map of early Kansas in the 1900s, and the red square indicates the general area of the eastern Kansas that the Myaamiaki were first removed to. Look a little bit closer, and that red square is, according to the map legend, again the place of general place of removal to. This is a mix of tall grass prairie, short grass prairie, and oak hickory forest. Mostly prairie with smaller patches of forest here and there. A far cry from the vast unbroken forests of northern Indiana. Very different. The climate differences, the growing season is significantly longer, 20 to 60 days longer in Kansas, in which longer a period to grow crops. In general, when the Myaamiaki looked out over the land in Kansas, it looked more like a prairie than a forest. Something more like this instead of that first slide I showed you of the forested areas of northern Indiana. Here, this is 100 miles west of where they were removed to, but the landscape is similar. You see mostly grasslands with occasional woods, whereas in Indiana, mostly woods with occasional grasslands. And a lot of the species are the same between the two areas, but their abundances of those species are not the same. They're a lot less than they were in Indiana. A little bit about Oklahoma. The natural vegetation from another Kukler map, and actually the best set of those maps is here on this campus. This map shows the northeastern corner where the Miami tribe's headquarters are now is a mix of eastern hardwood forest and tall grass savanna, which are grasslands with occasional trees. In the red square, it indicates, you can see Myaamia, Oklahoma, including most of the land holdings of the Miami tribe. According to this map, this vegetation map, the landscape is 75% prairie and 25% forest. So these are, again, are general. Now I'm thinking of some of the people out there that live there. So they're gonna know different than this map. But these are generalities still, but they do tell us things. So again, this forested area in Oklahoma contains many of the same species. This green area here, same species as Indiana. This is the very western edge of the eastern deciduous forest, a big forest type all over the Midwest and goes all the way down into this area. But as you approach the western edge, the numbers and how often you'll encounter those species, oaks, hickories, lots of understory species, becomes less and less and less. On the westernmost boundary here, there's so much prairie in the area that you see fewer and fewer of the forest species. Growing season, even longer in Kansas by a few weeks on average than longer in Oklahoma than Kansas, and significantly longer than Indiana, 180 to 200 days. And looking at the precipitation, there's significantly more precipitation in Indiana than in either Kansas or Oklahoma. This would have a direct effect on agriculture and native plants as well. Also, look at the state grasses. Indiana has no state grass because it's just not a big part of the ecosystem. Kansas has a state grass, little blue stem. And Oklahoma, sorry that's cut off, has a state grass, yellow Indian grass. So Indiana is not characterized by grasslands in general, but by forest. Major Sinclair and others, the government knew this, and the Myaamiaki knew this when they arrived. A few more maps to show you. This is kind of a neat map that's showing you the percent of species shared with Indiana as with other states. So as you move away, dark blue is Indiana, and as you move away from that, you get into less and less of the species are shared with Indiana flora or the species there. So where the red square is showing you Kansas and Oklahoma lands, and about 75% of the species are shared between the two. But again, remember that means not how many of those species are, but just if they're shared. Meaning if there was 1,000 pawpaw trees in, let's say, Wabash County, and then there was only one pawpaw in Lynn County, Kansas, they would both be dark blue. That means 100% shared of that type of species, but not the numbers. Hardiness zones, anyone out there, a gardener, you know about these hardiness zones. Plants in Indiana in general can take 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit more freeze time or colder temperatures than the plants in Kansas and Oklahoma. Native plants in Indiana are better able to handle harder and stronger frost in general than the South. And that means a lot of the plants that live in northern Indiana have underground storage organs or stems or root crowns. And so to handle that frost. And those are also often important and were important food plants for Myaamiaki. And a lot of those storage organ plants are still present in Kansas and Oklahoma, but they're very rare. Soils are different too. I'm not sure what time I've got, but I'll move past this quickly. Soils are pretty different between the two areas. Some similarities. Basically, you're seeing yellow where there's prairie and grasslands, and green where there's forest. So the prairie soils tend to be rich and fertile soils of grassland systems. In Oklahoma, you tend to get more acidic, less fertile soils in general than northern Indiana. These are just showing the depth of the soils. So thinner soils in western Myaamionki, thinner soils in removal lands than the richer, deeper soils in northern Indiana. In general, there are some differences, but take a quick look at one animal type, or two animal types. Buffalo numbers were higher in the plains in general, so this could have been a beneficial thing to move to the plains and have more buffalo. But by the time that Myaamiaki arrived, the numbers of the bison have already been dwindling from the huge slaughters for many reasons. One of them was to take away the food source of the Indians, according to the government. And another reason, some others really almost silly reasons, like to collect skulls and bones from which to make fertilizer for calcium and potassium fertilizer for crops. So they were slaughtered, and there was very few of them left. So this could have been a beneficial part of the removal, but it didn't turn out to be. So if anyone I should have not shown you this slide, but see if you can recognize this sound. I don't know if I can do this here. It's not going to play it for you, but it's the call of the whippoorwill, wikuya, or else I don't know how to do it. But an important ecological cue for the Myaamiaki, when they heard the first whippoorwill call in the spring, that indicated that the nighttime temperatures, air temperatures, were warm enough for the whippoorwill to know it's time to start chatting and breeding. But it also indicated to the Myaamiaki that it was time to get ready to plant. So nighttime temperatures directly reflect daytime temperatures, but it also reflects the ability of the soil to hold on to the temperature longer, because soil is denser than air, so it stays warmer longer at night. And it's a great indication that it's time, the soils are getting warm enough to cultivate. So would this be different in Kansas and Oklahoma than Indiana? Sure, it gets warmer sooner down there, and the whippoorwills would be calling sooner in the spring, which would still be a good cue for cultivation. It would just change, and you'd know you'd need to plant sooner down there. Although you can see where Kansas and Oklahoma are on the very western edge of the range of the eastern whippoorwill. So they would have been a good indicator for cultivation times if the people were still, wanting to listen for that. But they were rare in those areas. They're getting to be on the edge. They're not a prairie species. A table showing you the forest vegetation type is the most important historically for the Myaamiaki. Most of their food and useful species came from the forest. Total of 176 species useful out of the forest, where prairie is quite a bit less, almost a third less, or a third of the total in the forest. So it was a forest-based plant culture. Kind of saying the same thing here. I'll go by that one. So what this slide is showing you that with the change from Indiana to removal lands, we also see a shift from a diet based on root crops, underground plant organs, on the top line there. And most of these records were from Trowbridge, taken in 1824. So that information got received from Myaamia people would have indicated traditions and plant uses from before removal times. And they emphasized tubers and underground root organs as a major food source. So we're looking there, it's 32% of all the useful food plants were underground roots. And post-removal, after 1846, is when Jacob P. Dunn, did his work around 1900, and that emphasized leafy greens as a major food source. And so you see a shift from root crops to above ground parts of the plant, leafy greens, with removal in general. So that was definitely a change in diet. Some other landscape changes going on within Indiana that could also reflect on this question of how different were the lands, how did it affect the people. Back to the map of Indiana, the conversion of the forests, prairies, and wetlands to agricultural fields, the drainage and tiling of so many of those wet forest lands in northern Indiana did have an impact. There were dramatic landscape-wide transformations occurring in the 1800s and 1900s. So those vast areas of swamp, wet forest, wetlands, most of them were drastically, the size of those were reduced. And many of the culturally important aquatic plants, like water lily and lotus, their habitat was drastically diminished and replaced. So even the Myaamiaki that did stay in northern Indiana, and if more had been able to remain, that would have affected their diets and their availability for food plants as well. Not as much as the move did, but this is a picture of the lotus and the tuber here, the edible tuber, and it's showing you some people harvesting the tubers from underneath the ground. Now you look at this and you might think, well, maybe drainage of the wetlands is better. It's maybe a little easier to harvest these from dry land than from in here. And I have tried harvesting them from the water, and it's a mucky process. But really, these tubers will not grow. They don't grow when the soil is not inundated. They grow and they develop here. You're lucky if you have an ephemeral pond that kind of drains back, so you don't have to wade out in there to harvest them. But it was a big effect on these underground food plants. There was a lot less of them available here, but even less so in Kansas and Oklahoma as well. So that was a big change. This, much of what has been learned, I've learned and others about the Myaamia outlook on the land indicates a seasonal perspective, shown here by the lunar calendar based on northern Indiana seasons. The red line indicates western lands and the expansion of the otherwise short transitional seasons of spring and fall. So again, this is a lunar calendar for eastern Myaamionki, but I added the red lines showing how spring these normal short transitional seasons between the major seasons of summer and winter would be expanded and be significantly different. So the lunar calendar, this very ancient seasonal perspective and closely tied into the ecology of the system calendar, would be altered quite significantly and was upon removal. So again, look out your window in your lovely Wabash, Indiana home and you see forest. This is what you're used to. This is your medicine chest, your grocery store, your playground. And then you wake up one morning and you see this. You decide if it was not even so much, I don't want to interpret what it was like for the Myaamiaki of the past, but just myself or yourself. Like you move, what do you think about moving to Oklahoma? There's a lot to consider. And there was even more in the past. But ecologically, yes, they could have been more drastically different, but it was different enough ecologically to cause a lot of challenge and struggle to adjust. I got to that a little too fast. Again, in conclusion, the Myaamiaki moved from their forest home, where there was occasional prairie that they managed, to a prairie with occasional forest. Considering that most food plants came from the forest species, for the Myaamiaki, this change was undoubtedly a hardship to adjust to the new landscape. And my simple, if not silly, analogy is, imagine it's just you lived in Indiana and you normally go to your grocery store, farmer's market, where you buy all your produce, your fruits, vegetables, carrots, potatoes, and once in a while you need garlic and basil, herbs, in small amounts. Then you move to Oklahoma and you go to the same type of grocery store and discover rows and rows of garlic and basil, and only 2 baskets of apples and carrots. And you struggle. You say, this is crazy. Where am I going to get all the food I need? And until you learn how to make a garlic meatloaf, you're going to be challenged to make a meal. And that was, again, kind of a silly example, but maybe it gave me the feeling of what it would be like to be kind of in shock of your food sources changing so dramatically. You see some of the same species, but the availability and the abundance of those is vastly different. Thank you very much.